Hey, everybody. So you probably know this if you're watching right now, but my most recent video was one called Right-Wing Grievance Culture Posing as Literary Criticism, where I pretty extensively critiqued Hilary Lane's thoughts on evil and villainy in stories. Now, I did not realize just exactly how infamous Hilary Lane was on YouTube, but this video just really took off in ways I didn't expect. This new channel I started about a year ago currently has 10,000 subscribers, or did at the time this video was released. This video suddenly got out of the blue. So far it has 76,000 views, and my channel is coming close to 12,000 subscribers. Still really small by the standards of what I'm used to operating at, but it's pretty surprising. And so I guess I was pleased with it. People generally seem to like it. Some of her fans showed up, but hey, that always happens, right? One thing though, and this is what I want to talk about in this video, that people took exception to pretty broadly was my characterization of C.S. Lewis as a, how did I put it? A garbage Christian apologist. Some people did not like that, and I can kind of understand why. I personally don't think a ton of C.S. Lewis, but I can see why some people do. He has at least this stature as one of the most intellectual, philosophically thoughtful Christians, and maybe just in some people's minds, at least general thinkers of the early 20th century. And so for me to refer to him that way, kind of in their minds discredited my position by making me come off as too immediately combative, drawing too hard of a line in the sand and immediately dismissing people who I saw as being on the other side from me. And so, it'd be one thing for me to take a dump on Frank Turek and William Lane Craig and, huckster, maybe not William Lane Craig, but, those kinds of hucksters. But say that about C.S. Lewis, throw him in a bin with the rest of them. And that just sounds a little, like you just don't want to admit that any Christian is smart or cool or anything like that. So I can understand that. One thing that's worth saying from the start is that I was not, and this sounds a little funny, but I was not necessarily trying to characterize everything about C.S. Lewis and his entire body of work and him as a person and a thinker. That comment, even though, it was saying something about Lewis, the comment was more about Hilary Lane and why his work appealed to her. And that might not make sense now, but I think it will to some extent by the time we're done with this. Lane, as I was saying in that part of the video, seemed not so well read, especially regarding commentary surrounding Paradise Lost. There is a huge body of work discussing that poem, a lot of it saying the things about the devil that she just seemed totally surprised by. She thought that he was a petulant, boring, stupid character from the start, and that this whole idea that he was sexy or somehow appealing, she seemed to think that was new. And that just showed this amazing blind spot to what everybody's been saying about the poem since it came out. And the fact that she just seemed like she had closed her mind to all those books, or just hadn't even opened a book on the topic, yet still came up with one person, and that was C.S. Lewis. I just found that weird by itself. Even if he has written some great stuff, there are parts of his work that I think would appeal to somebody who likes what I would call garbage Christian apologetics. He does say a lot of garbage Christian apologist things, and I'm going to get into that here in a second to help explain why I said what I did. One thing that I would say is, number one, I am not totally unfamiliar with C.S. Lewis. I don't just have this, edgy online atheist grudge against him. I actually used to like him when I was a Christian. I've read a lot of his stuff. I read all the Narnia books. I used to be a principal at Christian school, and when I resigned, they gave me this parting gift, which is a book of C.S. Lewis's writings, which I immediately devoured. I kind of liked them, but even then I had this feeling that it was not glossy nonsense, but glossy simplifications. I tried in my mind to do a lot of heavy lifting for him to make his work seem more profound than it was. And he is a great writer. His stuff is very well written. He's pithy. He knows how to turn a phrase. But I felt like there were some empty calories in a lot of his writing, even though I didn't want to admit that to myself. And so I think there could be a couple potential things going on here when people see my comment about C.S. Lewis the way they do. One is that maybe he is just a better, more prolific, smarter writer than I was giving him credit for. And maybe I need to own up to the fact that my comment was a little too much off the cuff. Another might be that a lot of people want to see him as kind of this bastion of Christian thinking. And people do this a lot when they're invested in Christian apologetics. They're willing to accept that Kyle Butt, Frank Turek, all these guys, they're like sleazy used car salesmen and their stuff is kind of junk. But there are the smart ones out there. There's William Lane Craig. There is certainly C.S. Lewis. And they don't like to see those figures taken down a notch. I was there when I was a Christian. I used to be very critical of a lot of arguments for God. I thought that they were kind of, sleazy nonsense, just stuff that people were trying to pass by their audience. But C.S. Lewis, I held him up to a higher standard. And, you kind of need to keep those heroes in your mind to validate your position. And that's where I was. And that's why I tried to see the best in his writing when I was reading it. And so I can see how in a couple different ways this can come off as, I can see why people would take offense. Another one is a lot of these people might not even be Christians, and there is just this general aura around him within broader polite society. So I could see how even somebody just coming in from the outside could say like, oh man, I'm not a Christian, I'm certainly not an apologist, but this guy's being too dismissive of a really smart, cool person. And so I get that. So I hope that partly explaining my comment was about the parts of him that appeal to somebody like Hilary Lane more than about the totality of his work. Maybe that'll help some. But I also think it's worth pointing out some of the things he says in some of his apologetics work and some of his comments about atheists, because I think it does warrant calling him a garbage Christian apologist. Not calling him that name is, again, to sum up everything about him. But when he gets into apologetics, it's bad. It's really rough. He is as silly and juvenile as any other apologist. He just kind of has this, polite coat of paint over it, maybe because of the time frame he's from or the fact that he is an older figure. He comes off as kind of an elder statesman of Christianity. People see or maybe want to see more in his writings than is actually there. So I think looking at some of that might help. Now, one thing I think is worth adding when we talk about this part of C.S. Lewis's work is that I do not think it makes him dumb. I don't think it makes him somebody necessarily who can be entirely dismissed. I don't think it means that he has never written anything worthwhile. I think what has happened is that Lewis, like many other people, when they get invested in a religion, allow themselves to take a lot of shortcuts, especially when it comes to arguments for God. And I think C.S. Lewis indulged a lot of those shortcuts and just wasn't showing the best side of himself when he was trying to argue for God, and certainly not when he was talking about atheists. So I'm just going to go over a few quotes here from him. This could seem like another just drive-by hit piece on him. That's not what I'm going for here. This isn't meant to be a thorough refutation of his work. I know people are probably going to accuse me of taking these quotes out of context. Go read him if you want, see what you think of him. Specifically read things he says about theology and Christianity and arguments for God. Make your own conclusions. I'm just trying to show what I'm thinking when I refer to his apologetics as garbage. So here we go. Now, first off here, we have Lewis saying, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the universe has no meaning, we should never have found that it has no meaning. Now, what this quote shows me first off is that Lewis is really good at being pithy, at wordplay, turning phrases and sounding maybe more clever than he is, because this is really kind of nonsense. First off, I don't know that atheists would say the universe has no meaning. Meaning is made within people's minds. The universe certainly doesn't have inherent meaning, I guess, but meaning is something you create in your mind. It's a way you see connections between things, just a way you generally understand things, whether you find things significant emotionally or otherwise. That's all meaning. So I think what he's saying when he says we should never have found out the universe has no meaning, maybe we're part of the universe, and if it doesn't have it, we would have never known because we would also be meaningless or something like that. It sounds like I could be reading some things in between the lines, and maybe we'll see something here in a second that shows that I might not be. But I don't know. This is not only good wordplay, but it's good wordplay at the expense of anything that actually means anything. And when you break this down and actually think about it, it's just kind of nonsensical in a way that shows not that Lewis is stupid, but that he's willing to be a little nonsensical if it gets him to certain conclusions that validate his faith. And I find that that's a little bit sad. A second quote here that I find kind of related. The theory that thought is merely a movement in the brain is, in my opinion, nonsense. For if so, that theory itself would be merely a movement, an event among atoms, which may have speed and direction, but of which it would be meaningless to use the words true or false. Now, it might be pretty obvious in these last two quotes, especially if you're at all familiar with Christian apologetics, that Lewis is kind of flirting with, if not delving into, presuppositionalism. And that's a pretty sad place to be. Basically, the fact that we can reason and have minds and consider things indicates that God must exist or something like that. And what this is showing in both cases is a loose grip on abstractions, or an inability or unwillingness to ponder abstractions. Yes, thought is made up of movement in our heads, or it is generated by movement in our heads. Atoms move around, I guess, is a way you could put it, that generates thoughts, and we use those thoughts to ponder things. To take that and reduce it to it is only atoms is kind of silly. I've often compared things like this to saying that your house is only a stack of wood. Yeah, it might be made of those things. We might be made out of this matter, but other things arise from that are more meaningful. And so, reducing us to just atoms or just matter or whatever, and saying that we can't exhibit traits or make meaning in ways that extend beyond just the existence of atoms is just silly, and it seems a little willfully silly. And yeah, he sums this up by saying that atoms could have speed and direction, but it would be meaningless to use the words true or false related to them. And that just seems silly. The thoughts themselves are not true or false just because they're made up of atoms. Those atoms, when they generate thoughts, are generating thoughts that can maybe accurately understand and reflect and predict things about the physical universe. That's meaningful. We can observe the universe, notice things about it, and have thoughts that are more or less accurate. And to say that that can't happen because those thoughts are being generated by atoms is just plain nonsensical. I don't know if this really reflects anything about C.S. Lewis's ability to think and ponder questions about who we are and, what abstractions like thought mean and truth and things like that. But he's shortcutting his way to just really silly conclusions that I don't know if they were as common to Christian apologetics back then, but now are. This is just kind of by the book stuff, and it's just using wordplay to get yourself to conclusions about God. And I find it just kind of garbage. Sorry. Now, I know that's all kind of ethereal, even though it does show some clear shortcuts in Lewis's thinking, at least when it came to apologetics. But I want to show a couple things that reflect his thinking about atheists. And a lot of this is framed within his status as a former atheist and him reflecting back on that time. But I don't know, the way he even characterizes his past self seems to fall in line with hucksters like, J. Warner Wallace and what's that other guy's name? Christ for Christ, Lee Strobel. Sorry. I'm working on a video about him right now and I just forgot his name. But it's a thoughtless, silly, almost sincere sounding way of framing his past atheist self that to me either shows he's fudging to jump to conclusions about his past self that he can then generalize to atheists, or that he's just not really reflected well on his personal journey. I don't know how else to take this because some of the stuff is just plain silly. So here first we have, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got the idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Now, in this quote, he asks what I consider kind of a damning question, kind of telling on himself. He asks, but how had I got the idea of just and unjust? And I'm sorry, but if this question is owning anybody, it's just Lewis himself, because he's kind of admitting that he struggled to understand something extremely simple. Just and unjust, again, we're dealing with abstractions here. Just and unjust are just words we use to describe whether people are being treated fairly, to put it roughly. And you can develop that by understanding what it means to treat one person similar to the other and to know when that's not happening. So, if the law or anybody else showed preferential treatment to one person versus another, if they, gave them a really harsh sentence because of, say, their race or something like that, if they randomly let some people off the hooks and gave other people really harsh sentences for almost no reason, we could see the injustice in that. And how would you do that? I'm not saying it's super simple, but I think it shouldn't be that huge a puzzle to at least come to some rough understanding of what was going wrong when things are unjust and why that bothered you. So Lewis doesn't seem to be posing this question in a thoughtful and potentially not sincere way. I generally lean toward thinking it's just not thoughtful. I think he's just let himself take some shortcuts, and he really thinks these are good questions. When outside a conversation about Christianity, I think he wouldn't act like this is such a baffling thing. He says that you need a straight line to judge a crooked line, I think is how he put it. Let's see. Yeah, how do you judge a crooked line unless you've seen a straight line? That straight line doesn't need to be God, if we're to employ this analogy. You don't need God to understand justice. You just need to understand the concept of people being treated fairly and then know what being treated unfairly looks like by comparison. What does this have to do with God, and how is this really that difficult? Maybe I'm belaboring it at this point. Extending this to the universe is kind of weird because the universe doesn't think and thus can't, choose to treat people fairly and unfairly. But I think that, when you call the universe unjust, number one, it just lacks justice. So because it doesn't think, it just does things. And you can not say it's unjust in the sense that it willfully treats people unfairly, but maybe just its general indifference can look like a lack of justice or be a lack of justice. And so I can see how getting frustrated with the injustice of the universe could be your way of just seeing that something went wrong. And that's a way of especially in the case of a tragedy, venting your frustration and just your overall sense of helplessness in a condemnation of the universe being unjust. I can see that as an emotional outburst. It does nothing to get you toward God. And the fact that Lewis seems to think it does, again, I think the word garbage Christian apologist is warranted when describing this kind of thinking. It's not him as a person, but when he delves into these topics, he goes to some pretty stupid juvenile places. Now, this next one is just a real doozy, so let's read it. I was at the time living, like so many atheists or anti-theists, in a whirl of contradictions. I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing. I was equally angry with him for creating a world. Now, I'm sorry, but C.S. Lewis, if you can hear me now, and I'm pretty sure you can't, if that's what you thought when you were an atheist, if that is really what you thought, you were a fucking moron. But I'm not really sure that he thought this way, or if he did, that he was really much of an atheist in any meaningful sense. This is your typical, how can you be mad at a God you don't believe in thing? And it's really, really dumb. Atheists are not mad at a God they don't believe in. I am not mad at God. I have never been mad at God. When I was a Christian, I wouldn't have it in me to be mad at God. I did not allow myself the space to feel that kind of emotion. When I stopped believing, there was no God for me to be mad at, and I damn well knew it. So this contradiction is kind of made up, or if it is, it's describing a very narrow group of stupid atheists that must have included C.S. Lewis. But need I explain? Atheists are not mad at God. They find God belief problematic. They might be mad at certain people who hold God beliefs because of how those God beliefs, partly because of how those God beliefs lead them to act. And so to reduce that very rational and meaningful form of anger at, how these fake beliefs can cause people to behave toward others, how maybe in some cases they can be abusive to others within their circle, how they can use theocratic ideas just pulled out of thin air, ideas about what the supernatural wants and try to force everybody else to live according to it by, enacting theocratic laws. That is all perfectly good stuff to be angry about. When you reduce that to them being full of contradictions because they don't think God exists, but they're also mad at him for not existing and also creating the universe, you're not taking atheists seriously and you're not trying to. And I just find this quote from Lewis and this whole mindset, I think he's articulated this a few different times, to be just kind of not only stupid, but a little bit vile. And this is where I see Lewis kind of being the old-timey equivalent of a, internet poster. This is just basic juvenile trash talk aimed at people you don't agree with, and it's not thoughtful at all. I just want to close off with one other thing that shows that kind of posting attitude. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. So yeah, basically atheists are poorly read. And, if you want to stay an atheist, you better just keep yourself ignorant because, if you go exploring, you're probably going to become a Christian. I would guess he was going to say like I did. I don't know. I don't know. This just exemplifies that kind of trash talk, essentially. This is similar to something atheists say that I'm not a super huge fan of, which is to say the best way to become an atheist is to read the Bible. I can understand the thought behind that. Reading the entire thing does bring up some absurdities, especially if you think the Bible is the purely historical, inerrant, 100% accurate word of God. But I don't know. It just comes off as trash talk, especially when you do it in public, in ears reach of Christians. But in this case, it's even worse because you're just saying you go read anything, you're going to agree with me. And if you don't agree with me, then it's probably because you're stupid. It's, again, trash talk. Why? Now, my last one is going to be a little more extensive. This is an argument that he made that, to be a little biographical here for a moment, when I was that Christian who wanted to see C.S. Lewis as one of the smart and good apologists, I thought back at that time, Josh McDowell was one of them. I'd heard him speak a couple times and eventually came to think he was a little dumb. And again, this is as a Christian. I still wanted to hold C.S. Lewis up as that example of a great Christian apologist and great Christian thinker. And so this is the lunatic, liar, and Lord line of reasoning. I heard Josh McDowell's version of the argument and I thought, wait, this just doesn't make any sense and this is stupid. Even back then, I wanted to get to Christian conclusions. I believed in Christian conclusions, but I thought this line of reasoning did not get you there. This is dumb. Lunatic, liar, and Lord is basically saying Jesus had to have been either a lunatic, a liar, or Lord. And he couldn't be a lunatic or a liar because his teachings were too coherent to be a lunatic. He couldn't be lying because it would be super evil for him to lie about the things he did. And, his teachings were so good that he couldn't have been either a lunatic or a liar. And so he must have been the Lord. I'm kind of probably messing it up off the top of my head, but I told myself that's really dumb. But, I kept this comforting thought at the back of my mind that C.S. Lewis had to have a better version of it, or that because he used this argument and he's really smart, his must have been better. And I'm not so sure it was. So I just want to read what Lewis says about this. And it's going to be a little bit of a longer quote, but I think it's worth letting it play out. So here we go. I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on the level with a man who says he was a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him the Lord and God. But let us not come at him with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now, it seems to me obvious that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. Now, in this quote, you can see the glimpses of how I tried to distinguish him from, say, Josh McDowell, and how I tried to salvage him as a better apologist. I thought Josh McDowell was being really silly because he was trying to say that there are only these three options, lunatic, liar, or Lord, and that Jesus cannot have been a lunatic or liar for these reasons, and therefore he must have been Lord. Where C.S. Lewis was more, he wouldn't be that silly. He was more just trying to eliminate the idea of Jesus as a great teacher. It's only a great teacher who was just a human. He couldn't have been that because he claimed to be God. And so I'm not trying to argue to all of you out there that logically he must be God because of this trilemma, as they call it. I'm just trying to say it's silly to call him just a moral teacher. And that is in this to some extent. But even then, it's kind of silly. There's a lot of, I hope I don't need to explain it, simplifications in what he says. You don't need to be a raving lunatic to delude yourself into thinking that you're divine to some extent. Divinity meant a lot of things depending on where you were at in history. And so the whole poached egg thing is just really goofy. The difference between convincing yourself that you're a god or that you're in some way divine in convincing yourself you're a poached egg is just miles apart. There's no analogy there. I've heard some people, it might have included Josh McDowell, say that being a poached egg is even less silly than being God because being God is such a grander thing. Well, no, I'm sorry. An egg is just a poached egg anyway. It's just an inanimate object that you're maybe about to eat. How could you convince yourself that as a thinking, moving human, you are that? Whereas you can convince yourself that you have some sort of divinity within yourself. It also puts way too much stock on Jesus' claim to be God. Maybe the Gospels got that part wrong. Maybe some of them, especially John, overemphasized that part of his ministry. And so, I don't know, there are all kinds of options here beyond just there's these three options and there's not even room for him to be a great moral teacher. And he goes so far as to say, he would be the devil of hell. That's how bad he would be. I'm sorry. And maybe I'm just digging into this too far, but you go from maybe being somewhat deluded to an absolute raving madman. You go from taking advantage of people and, maybe being a little deceptive and claiming to be God to be like the devil of hell and an absolute terrible person. There are ways maybe you can rationalize that. There are ways maybe you're just a little bit sleazy. Maybe you start leaning toward that toward the end and you did some great teaching along the way. There's all kinds of options. And again, there's so little thought that goes into the nuance of this. And in fact, I see a lot of skipping over the thought to get to really neat conclusions that validate what he already wanted to believe about religion. And this just doesn't look like any of the signifiers of a serious thinker. Not that he wasn't a serious thinker in other parts of his life, but he wasn't really letting that part of himself come out here. And I think he was just really, again, like I've kept saying, showing that he's willing to take shortcuts on these topics. And so that's why when he delves into apologetics, I think it's fair to say that, he's a garbage apologist. But even as much as I wanted to look away when I was a Christian and not see this argument come from Lewis, he does actually use this to some extent to try to reason his way to God. Let's read the last part again. Now, it seems to me obvious that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. So basically, yeah, he uses lunatic, liar, or Lord to reason his way to God. Not necessarily saying I think that it's totally logically inevitable, but he does think that God is the more logical conclusion. And I think that's pretty wild. Even as a Christian, I thought it was wild. And I think I kind of tried to gloss over this part of his argument and, just tell myself he was reasoning more to, eliminating the good teacher way of looking at Jesus. I'm sorry, there is no credible, even halfway sane way of looking at a historical figure and concluding that what they said, could not have been this or this, therefore he actually must have been God. There are so many ways of reading his words as not absolute lunacy, not just being a horrible, horrible liar along the lines of the devil or whatever, and discrediting those, meaning like, he couldn't have done those because how could somebody who came up with the great teachings he did have been that bad? Therefore, he must have been God. Anything that gets you from, it must be this, this, or this, therefore it's God. It's classical argument for ignorance type lines of reasoning that you use to say it couldn't have been a cloud or an airplane, therefore it must have been a UFO. I just find it incredibly non-serious. So anyway, I think I went longer on that than I intended to, but maybe I hope that gives you an idea of what I was talking about when I said that Lewis is a garbage Christian apologist. At least when he delves into these areas, and even when he talks about theology in general, he says some incredibly silly things. He gives himself a lot of leeway to take mental shortcuts, just trash talk people he doesn't like, whether he does that directly or, using his supposedly past atheist self as a punching bag, like all these apologists, not all of them, but like many of them do. I just find that incredibly unserious. And maybe I shouldn't have characterized his entire body of work in him as a thinker using that phrase, and I'm sorry. But I do think that that is the part of him that appealed to Lane. From what I understand, people have been saying that she was homeschooled in, I think, a religious conservative environment. She shows that she is not really widely read, or she shows signs of that anyway. And what she is read in happens to align with somebody who maybe produced other things, but also produced this kind of neat, satisfying, conclusion-seeking rhetoric. And that just seems like the kind of thing Lane would zoom right in on, or maybe would have been trained to zoom in on by her parents and her immediate religious community, which I assume she's probably part of. Anyway, that's that. My voice is getting really rough. I'm wanting to cough really bad. My throat's getting a little raw. So I hope those thoughts helped. If not, sorry. If so, good. Have a good day, everybody.